My Govanen, everyone. This is the second installment that many of you have been waiting for of myself talking with GirlNextGondor about Tolkien and his critics. And in this particular video, we're going to be focusing not so much on a broad array of critics, but rather one critic in particular, that being Michael Moorcock, who was himself a sci-fi fantasy author who wrote an essay. Let's say it's hard to classify it as an essay because it's so rambling, but the essay is entitled Epic Poo. And specifically, there's two versions of this. There's an early version, and then he redid it later and expanded on it. We're actually looking at the later expanded version, and I've got a link for that. So if you want to read it yourself, I'll have that in the description below. But the purport of the essay is to criticize the style of Tolkien and other similar authors. Whether it successfully does that, we will let you decide at the end of this. Our opinion is decidedly no. With that said, I'll just go ahead and get us rolling with GirlNextGondor's first major comment, because we're kind of going to be working through sequentially through the essay, and she actually had the first comment that she wanted to make. So you had a comment on the rhythm and such of some writings that Moorcock was describing. So can you get into that?
Yeah, I believe I can. So the essay starts out with Moorcock observing that essentially the tone of what he calls, quote, high fantasy, and by not tone, so I need to be very specific with my terms here in terms of literary criticism, because I think one of the things that he's banking on is the tendency of people to conflate prose style, tone, mood, and a number of other things. So he's identifying what he considers a sonic quality to the prose style of, again, what he distinguishes as high fantasy. What he means by that exactly, he kind of describes later on, but the definition he never really gives a formal definition, and the implications that he's making do not necessarily hold up under scrutiny. But all that aside, he's focusing on the lulling, more rhythmic tone that he identifies in high fantasy, by which he seems to be referring to a lot of great classics that were written early to mid 20th century, usually by British intellectuals. And he gives a little, I believe this is his own little satire or parody of it. He writes a few lines of verse that go something like, up from the platform and onto the train got Welleran, Rollery, and young Arain, forgetful of sex and income tax, were Sauron and Mamalek Akanax, and in their dreams Dunsany's lord mislaid the communication cord, which is a reference to Lord Dunsany, a very influential fantasy writer of the 19th century, someone that probably most likely influenced Tolkien to one degree or another. And what he's identifying here is, he says, it's a lulling, lullaby, mouth music, frequently enjoyed not for its tensions, but its lack of tensions. He says it sounds like it's written on a train journey, and you can feel like the rhythm of it. Now, my suspicion is that this would be a quality that you would find in prose, not because of any sort of intent to coddle the reader or because of any laxity on the part of the author, but I think there might even be a little bit of an influence from the classical education in Greek that a lot of, particularly British and English people, but basically many Europeans and a lot of the American elites would have received around that time period, talking the 18th, 19th century. There's this, the Homeric epic, the Homeric epic meter, the meter in which Homer, for instance, was written, or the Odyssey and the Iliad were written. It's called dactylic hexameter. It's not something that we're familiar with in English, where we tend much more toward the iambic pattern of speech, but it's Greek, apparently. I'm not a Greek scholar, but this is what I know of Greek. Tends to enjoy that kind of rhythm. That's how most of the epic poems of ancient Greek were written, was in that da, 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 da. So knowing that Tolkien was a classicist and a linguist, and that he had a particular fondness of Greek, which he was reading and writing in very early age when his mother was still alive. She was one of the ones who introduced him to classical languages. Can we maybe say that this quality has more to do with the fact that all of these educated British gentlemen were probably reading the heck out of a lot of dactylic hexameter and were just conditioned to include more of those longer, complicated meters and metrical feet in their prose, in their English prose even, than we are today? But that is, it's speculation on my point, but it goes to show that he's already right off the bat, he's making a claim. He's saying basically, I think that it's written this way because it's trying to console and lull and distract the reader into feeling very sleepy and comfortable. And it's like, well, that's one explanation. Another very readily apparent explanation, one that I think has more, you could give more credence to, is the idea that maybe it's just as a result of the kinds of prose and poetry that these kinds of people would have been exposed to, these kinds of authors would have been exposed to. So that's my first point, and it's a little bit of a digression, but it stuck out to me. I was like, no, hold on a second. Those are all dactyls. It's natural that they'd be all writing in dactyls. It has nothing to do with trains, you silly man.
Right. Well, and this is a really good first point too, because it kind of sets up a lot of what we're going to see later on, which is he'll make a claim, and sometimes he doesn't even make a really solid claim. He just kind of puts something out there and kind of leaves it to you to infer what the criticism is. But even when he makes a claim, he very rarely gives any solid evidence for it. And so it's like, given that you admit you're speculating on the reason why there's so much dactylic meter in a lot of this prose, he's also speculating as to the reason. Like,
Yeah.
he doesn't know what's in Tolkien's mind or any of these other authors' minds. And furthermore, even if it was written for kind of that purpose, isn't almost any meter kind of the same way? I mean, the way we naturally speak in English tends to be, iambic, the ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. Any kind of rhythm is lulling. And that's the nature of rhythm. That's, it's like white noise. It always has kind of the same effect. It makes you tend to just fall into it and become a little more passive.
And as a writer, you can deploy that. You can invert the expected rhythm to create more of a sense of tension, or you can continue it on to create more potentially a calming effect, but also just more fluidity between thoughts. You can kind of lead people along with your rhythm if you're clever. A lot of this, of course, happening subconsciously.
Right.
So there's nothing, but yeah, like you said, there's nothing inherently wrong with making use of long chains of rising rhythms, and to assume that you know why the authors do that and why subconsciously they're drawn to that, which you identify as, you perceive as a lullaby effect. It's like that that's just like your opinion, man. Like,
Yeah.
you have no
cor-
evidence for that. You're just assuming that we're going to believe you because you stated it.
Yeah. And I think related to this is actually the next point that we both kind of touch on in our notes, was where he actually starts quoting Winnie the Pooh.
Yes.
And this is where the title of the essay comes from, of course, is the idea of, it's just like Winnie the Pooh is, according to Moorcock, supposed to like coddle you and make you feel, at home, safe, and, like nothing is there to worry about. And he then quotes this paragraph basically from Winnie the Pooh. And of course, it does read very saccharine and, just like there's no significant complexity to it at all. And his implication is that Tolkien is like this. And he pulls this fast one because he says, on the one hand, he gives this Winnie the Pooh quotation, and then he goes and he quotes a part of the Lord of the Rings, which is very early on. And I forget, is this the part where he actually quotes the whole thing about giants and other portents were forgotten for more important matters? or is that later?
I have it up. He gives a quote from Winnie the Pooh that's about little twinkling or tinkling and twinkling, I suppose, stream and the woods and all of that, and it's very soothing, which I'll get into. And then he says that this is the predominant tone of The Lord of the Rings and Watership Down, and he lists the wind and the willows. And then he goes on to quote, "One summer's evening, an astonishing piece of news reached the ivy bush and green dragon. Giants and other portents on the borders of the Shire were forgotten for more important matters." Yes, it's a quote from
Yeah,
The Fellowship of the Ring. That would
chapter
be
2
chapter
probably.
2. Yeah, because we're talking portents, so we're past the birthday party. We're now into
Right.
trouble rearing its head.
So the funny thing about this is he straight up admits, okay, a lot of people have said it's not fair to use these early parts of the book. You need to look at, other parts of the book for a different tone and style and whatnot, because after all, we are still in the Shire. And so he says, I opened the page randomly, and one may wonder about how random this is. And he finds the passage where Gandalf is telling Pippin about the history of the Palantiri, the Seeing Stones. And he quotes the passage and he says, well, here it is again. So it's not just the first part of the book, it's everywhere. And it's like, okay, you picked literally 2 paragraphs out of a 1,000+ page novel. And you didn't bother to look at any, say, battle scenes. You didn't, bother to look at any real dialogue. I mean, on just the face of it, he's picking 2 things which there's no reason to believe are representative samples. But the other thing that I find ridiculous about this whole thing, and this one of the other comments he makes, is that the this comment infuriated me. He says that the humor is often unconscious because Tolkien, how does he say it? Let me find it in my notes. He says something about Tolkien's he says Tolkien takes words seriously but without pleasure, which,
It's
as a man who literally invented the Elvish languages for the purpose of his own pleasure, phonetically speaking, that is an absurd thing to say.
it really
Now,
is.
maybe Moorcock didn't know that, but nevertheless, that's him making completely unwarranted assumptions again. So anyway, he says this, that it's unconscious humor, and quotes that line about the giants and other portents. And it's like, how can you think that that's unconscious humor? That is, I mean, you have to wonder if Moorcock is one of these people who never grew up enough to understand sarcasm. I mean, Tolkien is literally almost beating us over the head with the satire in that line. Hobbits are so concerned with their parochial affairs that giants and other portents are totally unimportant compared to the sale of Bag End, one piece of property in Hobbiton. I mean, that is so far from unconscious humor that I don't know how he even comes up with that line. But the other comparison was with Gandalf explaining the history of the Seeing Stones to Pippin. The context of that whole thing is Pippin is only half awake to begin with, and he's catching bits and pieces of what Gandalf is saying and then passes back into sleep writing on Shadowfax. So it's like, of course it's going to sound like that. We're getting this kind of from Pippin's perspective, and he's literally getting the information in a state in which he is falling asleep. So why would we expect it to be particularly filled with tensions and all these other things? So, I mean, just like the context of it all makes no sense. His claim that the unconscious humor, that makes no sense. So in light of all that, his choices don't even make sense on multiple levels. Did you have anything you wanted to add specifically on the whole Winnie the Pooh versus 2 random, if they're
Yeah.
random passages?
Yeah, only that let's assume that they are random. It's quite disingenuous, even with Winnie the Pooh, because what he's quoting from is the opening of a Pooh story, where everything starts out peaceful, as the beginning of stories, tends to do. It's like why they're the beginning, and then something happens to change that and to break the status quo. So you do need to do some work in the beginning to set a sense of some kind of a status quo. Yeah. And, you know, in a children's story like Winnie the Pooh purportedly is, although I would argue that it's actually a lot of it is more for the adults. I'm a big Pooh fan in my aging years.
Yeah, much of the humor of Winnie the Pooh is lost on anybody under the age of about 12.
Exactly. Or apparently on Michael Moorcock, who thinks that Tolkien is not being funny when he's describing. Like, that's the other thing is people do assume, and I've did a whole video on this and got some flack for it, people assume that the Shire is meant for Tolkien to represent this perfect idyllic paradise that's just he loves it so much and that's why he describes it with such affection. Well, he describes it with affection, but he's if you're open to the idea that he may not be always spelling everything out to the reader, he's also quite snarky at times about the small-mindedness of the hobbits, the gossip that's going on. As you pointed out, that passage where they're discussing potentially seeing giants and monsters and portents, and we know that in a few more paragraphs he's going to drop the name of Mordor and how even the hobbits are kind of shaken up by that. But no, they're all in talking and debating about Frodo and his family history and whether he's going to sell Bag End and all of that. So it's clearly, I would say, anyone who's reading it with at least a little bit of a critical consciousness of, okay, you know, let's not take everything the author says at exactly literally face value, would understand that there's some sly humor here. But apparently not. Apparently this is representative of the tone of The Lord of the Rings all the way through. And the other option that he gives us to judge this for ourselves, as you point out, is one where, again, you could quite easily argue that in a scene where someone is on a horse galloping over a long stretch of land with someone lovely knowledgeable wizard, probably a very soothing voice, going on and on about history, and you're a very tired little hobbit, maybe that's the effect that Tolkien's actually going for there. Maybe he's a terrible prose stylist, or maybe he's making these choices somewhat intentionally. So yeah,
For good
just
reason.
they're very, very vexing. But yes, it amounts to a restatement of your own points, I believe, on that point.
Yeah. Um, and then the next thing I wanted to discuss was where he says that Tolkien occasionally rises above this sort of prose, but then ruins it with the intrusion of ghastly verse.
Yes.
Did you have anything before that?
No, that's pretty much immediately he goes from citing Gandalf talking to Pippin to saying
Yeah.
that, well, sometimes he does better than that, which of course he doesn't bother to quote the points where he thinks Tolkien may be rising above this sort of thing.
Right.
He still, of course, hasn't identified what this sort of thing is. He's just given us examples and made some snide comments. He's never come out and said, what is it specifically, sir, that you're objecting to here? Is it the tone? Is it the subject matter? Is it the literal sonic qualities and rhythms of the prose itself? Like, what is it? He just says, oh, it's this sort of thing. All right.
Right.
And then he says that he ruins, every time that Tolkien does rise above it, he ruins it with ghastly verse, which is an opinion. You can not enjoy Tolkien's poetic efforts. He's certainly not for everyone. I think he's probably a stronger prose writer than a poet, but for heaven's sakes, if that's your argument, then make that argument. Don't drop it as if you've proved something and then walk away in the opposite direction.
Right. Well, and the thing to me, like the verse styles in the Lord of the Rings by itself are so varied
That's the other
already
thing.
that you can, like, there's some poetry in the Lord of the Rings that I like, and then there's some that I don't like as much. So
Mhm.
I like the Arundel was a Mariner poem. I really like the feel of it, the way he plays with, you know, the assonance and the alliteration and all those things. But then there's the poem where Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli send Boromir over the waterfall. I'm not as big of a fan of that one artistically. I mean, like, as a part of the story, it's very powerful and very moving, but artistically, I don't appreciate it as much. So it's like, which ghastly verse? I mean, like, there's
Right.
a bajillion poems in this story. They can't all be bad. I mean, really?
Yeah,
So,
we
because I mean,
go.
he goes Old English, he goes iambic tetrameter, he
Yep.
goes, I mean, just everything. He covers the entire scope pretty much of what you could do with poetry in an English speaking novel. So it's a
Well,
ridiculous thing to say.
and not even, if the English poetry doesn't float your boat, he also gives you examples of Sindarin and Quenya. We have actual elf Latin extempore laments from Galadriel, and then we have very lowbrow Hobbit humor poems from Sam.
Right.
And as you said, everything in between, things that are drawing from the Anglo-Saxon tradition. A lament for Boromir feels very much like a sort of a effort to translate a kind of overly sophisticated Gondorian poetic tradition into an English mode. It's yeah. First of all, if you're gonna say his verse is ghastly, which again, some of his poems I think are more solid than others. Point out which ones and what
And
about them is
why?
ghastly. And then secondly, it's very difficult to say that all of the verse is ghastly because there's so many different modes of it, and they're all there really to serve the story and to exemplify the cultures of the people who are speaking them.
Right. And I mean, if you're going to say that like you said, the lowbrow Hobbit poetry is ghastly because it's lowbrow, that's
That's
the
the
point.
point.
I mean,
Jinx.
again, in service to the story, that's kind of where we're going with this. And then let's see, what did I have next in here? My next thing was where he starts talking about Chesterton and other Christian
Yep.
writers. So, did you have anything in between those two, or
Nope.
okay, so
Yeah,
that's where you went next.
I have the essay in front of me and I've been following along. We really are jumping from one sentence to the next here. It's
Well, the early part is very thick.
is very thick, and the logical leaps need to all kind of be identified and called out for what they are.
Yeah, so next he gets into comparing Tolkien with other writers, and he compares him to G.K. Chesterton, who was like Tolkien a Catholic, and he mentions other Christian writers and says that he and these other writers see the honest artisans as the bulwark against chaos, and that these honest artisans are idealized because the last to complain against the status quo. They represent good common sense as opposed to perverted intellectualism. Now, some of this is paraphrased. I'm not directly quoting; these are just my notes. But then he turns around and says that the Tory views of the Inklings, which I don't know that all the Inklings were Tories, but let's assume for sake of argument that they were, quote, doesn't ask any questions of white men in gray clothing who somehow have a handle on what's best for us, unquote. Now, I find this very striking because on the one hand, it's the honest artisans who are the bulwarks against chaos and even opposed to perverted intellectualism. But also, we aren't supposed to ask any questions of white men in gray clothing who know what's best for us. Is it just me, or has Michael Moorcock set up two different things that are completely contradictory to each other and made it seem like they're the same?
Yeah. Yes, it's yeah.
And
shaking my head here.
Let's not beat around the bush because, I mean, Tolkien certainly had a very strong conservative streak to him. And I don't mean conservative as in the Conservative Party. I mean, he very much favored conservative things like conserving nature and conserving old ways of life and, conservative in the most literal sense. And that's why he favors, honest artisans and, all these other things. These all make honest livings in their own ways and, all this other stuff. So certainly there is an element of that in Tolkien. But if you want to start claiming, and he never says this directly about Tolkien, and this is another
Of course.
area where the point is, like you say, so often he says something and he leaves it to you to make these connections that aren't really there, but that he wants you to make without him stating it. You can't possibly say that about Tolkien because of Saruman.
Well,
that one example by itself blows the whole white people in gray clothing out of the water. And I mean, he's almost literally a white person in gray clothing. He's just actually a shade lighter than gray. It's Saruman the White. He's literally like the intellectual, par excellence in Middle Earth, and he's a bad guy.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I really enjoy about The Lord of the Rings is that Tolkien certainly has and acknowledges his preferences and his opinions, but he's also very willing and even goes out of his way to introduce counterexamples of his own tendencies, if you will. So we have the idea he very much values noble, wise men who are descended from a long line of kings and that they have charisma and leadership and all of that. And he likes those characters. But he also likes to take those characters and make them not have all the answers or straight out be antagonistic. So we have, of course, Boromir, who's a young noble and a heroic warrior and has many, to Tolkien, admirable traits, very heroic traits. And he, of course, succumbs to the lure of the ring. Then we have Boromir's father, Denethor, who is like the most similar person to Aragorn, probably in looks and in lineage and in just the acuity of his mind and in his leadership and charisma that we have in Middle Earth. They point this out several times in the appendices and in the actual book itself, that he reminds Pippin a lot of Aragorn. He's supposed to be this very, the type that Tolkien likes. And Tolkien takes him and he says, yeah, but he's not all with it. He has one fatal problem, and that's his pride and his belief that he does know best, and that nothing that, that he's seen all ends, and he knows how everything is going to go, and he's going to make his choices accordingly to preserve his own sort of ambition and sense of power and control. So goes out of his way to invert that trope in story and show us that yes, these our leaders can go wrong. Even the best leaders can go wrong. Even leaders I would probably really like or be drawn to can go really, really wrong.
Right.
And so, as you said, we have Saruman, we have Denethor, and then we have Boromir kind of being a variation on that theme. Saruman's whole thing is that I know what's best for you. Sauron himself was originally an I know what's best for you kind of a guy. And then the actual good characters, Aragorn, Gandalf, even Theoden to an extent, the legitimate leaders are the ones who say, I don't know what's going to happen. All I can do is do my best and let the hobbits, the humble people, let them make as much of their own decisions as they can and hope that they're going to be the ones to turn this thing around, because all I can do is just be like, yeah, don't park your boat there. It's a bad idea. And I hope we don't all get wiped out by Sauron.
Yeah, well, and even with the hobbits, you've got contrasts within the same culture, because you've got Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin on the one hand, but then you also have Lobelia, Sackville Baggins, and Ted Sandyman, who are, Lobelia Sackville Baggins obviously kind of redeems herself at the end of the story, but Ted Sandyman ends up being one of the most petty, ugly characters, and it's, he's a miller. He's an honest artisan, you might say, although there is apparently, I'm not as familiar with this, but I've heard it pointed out, I think by Corey Olson, that there's like a really rich literary tradition of the miller being like a corrupt individual. So Tolkien's probably drawing on that, but nevertheless, I mean, like being a miller is honest work. I mean, it's not a thing that's just easy to do, but yet Ted Sandyman ends up being this really nasty, petty character who sides with Saruman at the end. It's just, so even within his own constructs, like you say, he's got contrasting, parties on both sides within every category, every level, however you want to look at it. So again, that's just another one of those things where Moorcock tries to make you think that, he's made a point, when really, if you actually look at the story at all, it's like, which book did you read, pal?
Yeah. Well, and of course, this is in the context of he has just lumped Tolkien in with Chesterton, other writers like that, which I can imagine some of the writers he's talking about, they all, I believe, have very different tones and subject matters and tendencies and themes that they pick up on. And then, of course, with the Inklings, who did have some, I guess, intellectual sympathies. But again, you're looking at Tolkien, Lewis, and Charles Williams. Those are the kind of core three. They all wrote very different books, and
very different.
In fact, frequently argued quite passionately about their aesthetic and philosophical differences. So to say that writers like this write this way, when even a cursory examination, because again, I'm no expert, but a cursory examination suggests that they are more different in some ways than they are alike. It's very much what I was saying as I was reading through this is like an argument by proximity. You're trying to put two claims together that sound as if they confirm each other, but you're actually just putting the ideas next to each other and hoping that we will associate some sort of causal connection between them when you in fact haven't made any, because you know that there is in fact no causal connection you can make, but that, perhaps is uncharitable of me. Yeah. Yeah, he's hoping that we will do the work of saying, I see, you've proven that. And in fact, he's really done nothing of the kind.
Not even close. Let's see, my next one is where he talks about moderation ruining Tolkien as a romance, let alone as an epic. The Shire is safe, wild lands outside are dangerous, experience of life itself is dangerous. Do you have anything that comes before that point in the essay?
Let me see. Again, there's a couple of paragraphs where he starts his next paragraph by saying, I suppose I respond so antipathetically to Lewis and Tolkien. I was like, wait a second, this is the first time we've mentioned Lewis by name.
Who is a very different author.
Who is a very different author, who is famous actually for arguing with Tolkien. Like I said, they would go on and on about it. And then he talks a little bit about other novelists in the post-war period. But again, he's putting that idea out there, but there's no way to connect it to specifically Lord of the Rings. And then, yes, what he goes on to is moderation was the rule. The little hills and woods of that Surrey of the mind, the Shire, are safe, but the wild landscapes everywhere beyond the Shire are dangerous. Well, we know that, oh boy, there's just so much to unpack with that. The whole point of Lord of the Rings, specifically that first half, book 1 of Fellowship of the Ring, which is the one that supposedly Moorcock has the greatest distaste for, just from a aesthetic standpoint. Yeah. That's the whole point of that book. Is the hobbits think they are safe. They think the Shire is safe. They think nothing bad can ever happen in the Shire, and very, very quickly they are proven wrong. The actual Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, the Sauron's most feared and powerful servants that even the hobbits vaguely have some inkling that, oh yeah, those guys are bad news, show up in the Shire, start asking questions of those honest artisans, and are tracking Frodo down and paying off spies in all their cozy little inns. So it's very much the story of the hobbits setting out thinking, well, this is, I guess we can't stay in Hobbiton, but we're in the Shire, and nothing bad's gonna happen today, guys. And they're wandering down the road, and there's Nazgul, and there's elves, and there's Tom Bombadil just out of kind of nowhere. Right. They're walking through the woods and they find Tom Bombadil and they're like, how long have you been here? And he's like, oh, pretty much forever. And they're like, what are you? He's like, I don't really know. Not important. Ring-a-ding-a-dillo. And it's like the whole point of that book is things are a lot stranger and weirder and way more dangerous in the Shire than everyone, especially Frodo, could have ever conceived. And then they make it to Rivendell thinking, okay, well, we've made it here. The clever men and the white men in gray coats, the lovely elves with their knowledge and their wisdom, who are really the ones who should be in charge of all this. Surely they will tell us what to do and we can just do that and we'll be great, And no, as it turns out, in Rivendell, they find that the clever men in their gray coats who are supposed to know everything are standing there with their hands out like, I don't know, what do you want to do with it? Well, we could give it to Círdan. No, we can't give it to Círdan. Well, we could give it to that Tom Bombadil guy. Now, I don't trust that Bombadil guy. I don't understand him at all. It's like, you guys are supposed to be the ones who know what's going on. And you're telling me that I have to go to Mordor because I'm the only one who can save the world, and I don't even know which direction Mordor's in? Like, the whole Fellowship of the Ring is taking that trope of, oh yes, you have an idyllic little countryside, and just subverting it mercilessly.
Yeah. Well, and, even before we get to Rivendell, we have Gildor telling Frodo, like, I'm not offering you advice, dude. That's dangerous stuff. and he also straight up tells Frodo, it's not your own Shire, in response to, I never expected to find danger in my own Shire, but it's not your own Shire. Never has been. You're just like a passing transient thing in this part of the world. But the other thing too is that's kind of the point of, like you said, that whole series is it gets stranger and you start to realize there's more danger and bizarreness in this world. And we get this kind of echoed again later where several of the Dunedain meet up with Aragorn in Rohan, and a conversation starts up where one of them, Halbarad, makes the point that, these hobbits are really simple folk, but we love them nonetheless. And at another, I'm trying to remember, is it Aragorn in the Council of Elrond who, I can't remember who says it exactly where, but somebody makes the comment, like, if you're going to protect simple people from outside dangers, simple
Yeah.
they will be. And that's one of the things that we see in the character arcs of the hobbits is they become less simple and less safe. But that's kind of what their growth is about. It's like you have to
Mm-hmm.
encounter things outside your comfort zone and realize that it's not just this nice little countryside where everything's perfectly happy and you just get to live your life. I mean, there are bigger and badder things out in the world, and sometimes you have to face up to those things. And that's kind of the point of their story is they have to grow up and, leave that nursery room type safety and become mature adults capable of taking significant action in a dangerous world.
And this is all to say nothing of, I'm imagining we'll get there pretty soon, the end of the book, where they come home to what they still believe in their hearts is somehow safer than the world outside. And they find, oh no, Saruman is here just like doing stuff and killing and imprisoning people. And all of our friends have just kind of let this happen because, oops, I guess we were never really as safe and as virtuous as even we thought we were.
Yeah,
So,
that
and this
definitely comes
is
up later, and it's
a
going to be a big one.
yeah. It's like, so, even the hobbits in the very final chapters of this book, Tolkien is saying like, oh, now, don't think that they're safe now. Don't think that they can just have this little adventure and they've grown as people and they've saved the world and oh, okay, so like we're safe now, we're good, we're returning back to safety. He sets you up to believe that, and then he's like, nope.
Yeah, which is interesting because Michael Moorcock apparently draws the exact opposite conclusion.
Yeah,
But
apparently he missed that part.
yeah, we'll get there.
We will.
um, so and then he has this line, and I'm just going to throw this one out there. If the Shire is a suburban garden, Sauron and his henchmen are the mob. And this again, this is one of those things where one of the themes that comes through if you read this whole thing is Moorcock has a lot against Tolkien on purely political grounds. We've already
Mm.
seen that in the comment about the Toryism. We've seen it in the comment of, about him favoring the artisans and all this. And here it is again in a similar form. It's like, the Shire is just like a middle class white suburban home, and then Sauron and his henchmen are the mob. As one wonders if he wanted to put quote marks around that, almost as if he sympathized with the mob. But it's like the idea of just having this knee jerk conservative feeling of, I have what I have because I work for it, and you can't have any, poor restless people out there. So don't come and get it. That almost seems to be what he's accusing Tolkien of, but it's like, what? Where did you pull that from anyway? I mean, like the whole point of Frodo's journey is that he's leaving his stuff, his
Mm-hmm.
very comfortable life, in order to save literally everybody.
Literally everyone.
It's like, I mean, sure, there's an element of that very staid and comfortable hobbit who doesn't want to get involved in adventures, and that's, the Hobbit is all about kind of poking fun at that. But that's a part, every culture has its vices. The Hobbit culture is they're comfortable and they don't want to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole point is you can't just live in that way forever because things are going to happen. So this idea that it's just some kind of weird knee-jerk reactionary outlook by Tolkien, which he seems to be implying by this line, which doesn't really have any coherent meaning, but that's like the only thing I can pull out of it. It's
Yeah.
just, I mean, and this is going to come up again. Again, you'll see in a lot of these criticisms, Moorcock is really angry about Tolkien's politics more than anything else.
And I would say even he's angry about what he perceives as Tolkien's politics.
Right.
I don't know that that he's really, I wouldn't blame him for this. I would doubt that he's spent a lot of time really getting into the deep waters of what Tolkien thought and the complexities of his opinions, because he wasn't. There are some ways in which you can see very clear trends, but there are other ways in which he's very unexpected, even in the hints in that we get in the letters as to what
Oh
his
yeah.
political leanings were and what his opinions were on day-to-day affairs and the stuff that was happening during his lifetime. So I don't blame Moorcock for that necessarily. I do think it's interesting that he's choosing so often to criticize Tolkien on things that, number one, he claims are in Lord of the Rings when the opposite is pretty clearly true.
Very clearly.
And then number two, that he's taking such umbrage with what he thinks are Tolkien's politics without ever spelling them out. And again, if he were to spell them out, I doubt very much that they would represent an accurate picture of, again, of Tolkien's politics, much less any sort of generalization you could make about, that sort of writer of the mid 19th to mid 20th century, of a certain, tendency and class and so forth. I do find it funny in this paragraph. So he calls the Shire a suburban garden when it's very clearly not at all
Not
suburban.
suburban.
It is rural agrarian. That's kind of the point.
Very.
He talks about how for the hobbits, or people like the hobbits, good taste is synonymous with restraint, pastel colors, murmured protests. And I find this a hilarious example because, of course, the hobbits are known for liking garish colors and overindulging in food and drink and merriment in just at every conceivable opportunity. They're like,
so much so that they have to be wheelbarrowed out of Bilbo's party. I mean,
that they take their children from party to party just to let the kids eat free food, because otherwise they'd go broke trying to keep up with the appetites of hobbit children. It's a very grounded, very life-affirming culture where they're not about restraint. They're about seizing and enjoying everything they can to
perhaps
the
too
fullest.
much.
Yeah, overindulging in comfort and overindulging in smugness, and Tolkien celebrates the cool aspects of that, the fact that they're very rarely impressed by nobility. They are very pragmatic. It takes a lot to get them down, but on the other hand, they can be kind of soft in the middle in the in the ethical sense. Very very easy to just go along with what's happening. So it's kind of funny again to see the Shire characterized as something that not only is like, oh, that's not really fair, it's like it's aggressively not that. If you read the book, you would not be talking about it this, or rather if you read the book without any preconceived notions, which I think is really probably what happened here.
Oh, and did you have anything like with before the mention of, is Sauron really as evil as we're told?
No, let's go straight to that.
Awesome. He starts it with a reference to the courageous characters are like retired colonels driven to write letters to the Times, which is, again, did you read this story? Who is writing letters? None of these people are sitting back on their bottoms, proclaiming from their armchair, here's how I would run the world and blah, blah, blah. No, these people are all actually actively engaging in literally saving the world by risking their lives. What in the world is like a retired colonel writing letters to the Times about that? But more to the point, and he goes on and he says, we're not really sure if Sauron is really as evil as we're told. And then this is one of the most famous lines from this. He says, after all, anyone who hates hobbits can't be all bad. And it's like, now, again, Michael Moorcock probably hates hobbits because he hates simple-minded, comfortable, placid characters.
Yes.
Because he thinks that those people ruin civilization. And he's right, which is why Tolkien remorselessly makes fun of that precise characteristic about hobbits. Like, if you read The Hobbit, literally Bilbo's entire character arc is about becoming less comfortable, less stay-at-home, less passive, and learning to be adventurous and live outside of his comfortable little hobbit hole. That is literally his story arc.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much the same arc we get with Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin. Taken
much more seriously.
Right, with a lot less humor and a lot more serious stakes.
Yeah, turned up to 11. It's a couple of things on this. He says, we are not sure, because Tolkien cannot really bring himself to get close to his trolls and their satanic leaders, if Sauron and co. are quite as evil as we're told. Now, it's true that we don't ever see much of Sauron as a character in Lord of the Rings, because, for literary reasons, you kind of need to keep your big bad off stage when he's that overwhelmingly powerful.
Right.
But we see a lot of Saruman. We see Grima. We get to spend a lot of time actually hanging out with actual orcs and hearing them talk and hearing them argue. And even there's times at which they appear a little bit sympathetic. We get the Nazgul quite up close and personal. Now, admittedly, Nazgul are just more of a monstrous thing than an actual character.
Right.
But Tolkien gives us plenty of dialogue and motivation and character growth and development, even, for usually negative development, of all the other villainous and semi-villainous, borderline ambiguous antagonistic characters that he includes. We know exactly what happens with Denethor. We know what goes down with Boromir. We get to see that at close quarters. Saruman goes from being this relatively noble figure to being just this shrieking, clawing, nasty, petty, vindictive, just shrunken down shell of a person by the end. And we get to see all that fairly closely as well.
And we get to see the route he takes to get there, which is basically he is, like I said earlier, kind of the intellectual par excellence of Middle Earth. And then he goes the route of, I'm so smart, I ought to be telling everybody else what to do, so I'm going to feed them. He gives this speech to Gandalf where he's like, this is the smart way to go. This is the practical way to go. If we do it the other way, we're going to lose. So even though this may look bad, we need to do it this way, and it'll be for the ultimate good in the end. And that ultimate good, by the way, is us being in charge of everything.
Yeah.
And from there, he devolves from wannabe mega tyrant to pettiest of petty tyrants.
Yes. Tolkien shows and makes it apparent why the will to domination tends to be the kind of the key factor here. Why the will to dominate others for whatever reasons. You could start out with, according to Tolkien, very noble reasons, wanting people's lives to be better. That degrades your personality until what seemed plausible at first turns out to just be this loathsome, repulsive. It really is that bad. It really is that evil. I don't want to spend time with orcs. I've seen them. I've read a few chapters about them, and they don't seem to be very nice people. And I don't want to be associated with that kind of behavior. And moreover, I don't want to see any of that behavior in myself. And I can see now because again, this is one of the things Tolkien shows you in the book. You need to be very careful because it's not always clear from the beginning where someone is going to go, where someone's going to end up. Some things may seem like it's a sensible, reasonable, smart, prudent, wise course of action, but depending on the motives, it can end up in the same sort of appalling place that you would associate with just orcs, basically.
Yeah, well, and as Elrond tells us in, I believe, the Council of Elrond, even Sauron was not evil in the beginning.
Right, and those of us who know the lore, kind of even know the fuller, expanded version of that.
Right. I mean, his road actually is a lot like Saruman. So by seeing how Saruman goes down that road, we actually kind of have a pretty good idea of how exactly Sauron went down that road. It's like, I know how to make things better for everybody. Why won't they listen to me? Stupid people. I'll just get rid of them.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what it comes down to.
It really is.
I think I had another thought on that.
It's interesting that Moorcock is kind of aligning himself with that, maybe not realizing.
Oh, I remember what I was going to say. When you quoted the thing in full, you reminded me of a word that I did not include in my notes, and that was proles. Which, again, politically a very substantial, loaded, significant term. And again, we can see Moorcock's real objection here popping through. He's like, he's assuming that Tolkien is against all these people because they're just the proletariat. It's like, have you read any Tolkien besides what you imagined in your head?
It's almost as if people told him that somebody told him this, of course, that in their opinion, Lord of the Rings was an anti-whatever, probably given the time period and the criticisms he's making, probably something that it was anti-socialist.
Right.
For a very narrow definition of what that person saw in the book. And Tolkien himself would have said, we've beaten this into the ground. I know you and I have both probably mentioned this at several points in our lives. Applicability. The Lord of the Rings is not an allegory. It has applicability to almost any situation you could think of. And so, of course, if you look at things like, you could take any political movement, any controversial act or item or anything of basically the last probably 500 years, and you could draw parallels and apply certain themes and lessons and characters onto that from the Lord of the Rings. That's because it's a good book that has fairly broadly applicable themes.
Right.
Not that it was written specifically in opposition to a specific iteration of a specific political philosophy of the 1950s, let's say. So, and it's like someone told Moorcock that that's what the book was about, so then he read the book and that was all he could see in it. Well, instead of saying, well, I don't know, let's actually read this book and try and figure out what is trying to be communicated in it.
Yeah. And in fairness to Moorcock, it should be noted that Tolkien was a devout Catholic, and as a devout Catholic, almost certainly would have been opposed to communism.
Yes.
So, I mean, yeah, his writing is going to reflect that to some extent, but that doesn't mean every villain in his story is the communist proletariat.
Yeah.
That's an oversimplification by a mile.
Yes.
And especially because we have examples like Saruman, who is clearly not the proletariat and is clearly the overweening intellectual who wants to be a tyrant. I mean,
yes.
So
Tolkien was opposed to communism. Tolkien was opposed to a lot of things. Most things, I think, in fact, he was critical of, even the things that you would suspect that he would be more in favor of.
Yeah.
Oh, that was maybe a sentence and a half, and I think it sparked a good 10 minutes of ranting.
Yeah, well, it's okay. We're about to get to the most ridiculous, and we presaged this a little bit before. He mentions that Tolkien goes against the grain of his subject matter and forces on us a happy ending as a matter of policy. And he here refers to, of course, his essay on fairy stories, where he talks about the consolation of the happy ending and why that's so important. And in this context, he also implies that the Lord of the Rings kind of ignores death. And both of these statements are just, they're so ludicrous. It's ridiculous. Just to kill the death one right off the bat. We, of course, see Boromir die right up front. We literally see Aragorn holding him in his arms when he dies. And we see Denethor commit suicide in front of our eyes. We see Theoden die, who is a much more sympathetic character, because he's, not redeeming himself even like Boromir. He's just a straight up good guy, and then he dies on the battlefield. So it's not like the stories are unacquainted with death. But this idea that Tolkien forces on us a happy ending, well, yes and no. Like, the whole idea here is that the overall arc of history turns out well because the ring is destroyed, but who in the story gets a personally happy ending? Not Frodo.
No.
Frodo is a broken person by the end of the story, and that's why he leaves Middle-earth. And, for anybody out there who has this notion, let me disabuse you of it now. Frodo's not going to heaven when he sails across the ocean.
Nope.
That's not what's going on. He is seeking healing in the Undying Lands before he does inevitably die, because he is wounded and cannot find rest in Middle-earth. He must leave for his own good. So this idea that Frodo has this happy ending, it's like, yes, there are a lot of happy endings. Aragorn gets the girl, Sam gets the girl, Merry and Pippin seem pretty much happy. Gimli and Legolas do cool stuff after the fact. But like Frodo, who has been the protagonist since, practically the first chapter, is not given a happy ending. And neither is Boromir, and neither is Theoden. And I mean, some of our, very good friends in this story die. And even though Frodo doesn't die on the page, he's not happy by any stretch.
Yeah. And I mean, I paused when I saw the Lord of the Rings ignores death and was like, aren't there multiple letters in which Tolkien says, well, I mean, I guess if you had to say there's a moral or a theme or an underlying message about Lord of the Rings, it's a novel about death. Like
Fall,
and
mortality, and machine.
ending and yeah, he frequently references that death and the human attitude toward death and all that implies, the good parts of it, the bad parts of it, the horror of it.
Right.
That's what the book is concerned with, and that's the problem that it's kind of chewing over and looking at from different angles, trying to make sense of, and you can't really fully make sense of it by the end, but it does kind of come to some sort of conclusion that there might still might still be able to approach life with a sense of hope, even if this is why on fairy stories his quotation is so funny, even if it seems like there's nothing that can possibly redeem or make worthy the horrible amount of pointless suffering that you see all around you. It's like Tolkien says, yes, look at all this suffering, look at how pointless it seems, look at how awful it is, and then oh look, somehow something good came out of all that. And you're
Yeah.
like, wow, that's great. So first of all, that's not necessarily, just even if we ended it there, it wouldn't be a simplistic message. But then he says, except, you're still life's gonna go on. You're still going to have to deal with the suffering. And the
Yeah.
suffering is still going to seem pointless, even as you can see some things coming out of it that are good to you. It might still be just anguish. And I was just very kind of changed tack slightly. Again, that Moorcock would quote from On Fairy Stories, which is not part of Lord of the Rings. It's a well-known essay, and it's fairly, accessible, easy to find.
Right.
And it is famous for being where Tolkien lays out, among other things, his narrative theory of the eucatastrophe, which is frequently misunderstood and oversimplified and abused and made to mean things that Tolkien quite clearly did not mean when he was talking about it. But
Right.
it's weird that Moorcock would go to the trouble of dragging this quote out of On Fairy Stories, which I guess I will assume that he actually read the whole essay.
Yeah,
But
let's be
then
charitable.
let's say that he didn't just they didn't have Google in those days, so just went to one of those quote dictionaries that they used to have where you could look up little tiny snippets of famous things that famous people had said that were supposedly representative of their thoughts and opinions on a matter, or just were really snappy and looked good at the head of your essay or whatever. Let's say
Right.
that he actually read On Fairy Stories. It's astonishing that you could get that deep into Tolkien's thoughts and his arguments and his explanations of his aesthetic goals and come away with this idea that he wants everything to be a happy ending, and that's why he goes against his own literary impulses. It's almost the other way around. He gives us the happy ending, but he can't leave it there. He has to go and write a whole third tertiary ending where it's but things are still really messed up for everyone. Sorry.
Right. Well, and that's why a lot of people find the scouring of the Shire so jarring. It's like, why didn't we just get our happy ending and it was over?
Yeah.
Apparently Moorcock missed that chapter.
Yeah.
Because it's staring you in the face. It's never that simple. And that is Tolkien's message. Even in The Hobbit, where it seems a lot more like a standard happy ending for everybody, Thorin dies on the page. We see that happen, and Bilbo is crushed over it. Tolkien rarely gives us just a purely happy ending.
And then he comes home and they're selling his stuff off, which is kind of his own little mini. It's the
shock.
same thing. It's the scouring of the Shire in miniature. He comes home having had this adventure, and he finds that, oh look, my neighbors are just as venal and self-serving as I used to be. Oh, gross. They're never going to fully accept me again, are they? Good thing I got all this elvish money.
Yeah. Yeah, no kidding. So at this point, there's a huge section where he just starts going off on other authors, and he doesn't really talk much about Tolkien after this point.
No.
Did you have any other notes that we didn't already go over on this?
Yeah, we have, so there's a paragraph, writers like Tolkien, again, who like Tolkien and like Tolkien in what way?
Yeah.
Take you to the edge of the abyss and point out the excellent tea garden at the bottom. What?
I didn't even know what to make of that. I didn't even include that in my notes because I was like, I don't even know what to say in response to something that's so A, it's meaningless. B, it's absurd. I mean, that line, I just read it and I tried to think what he could possibly mean by that, and I couldn't come up with anything. And so I just didn't even bother.
Yeah, it's very odd. Again, I believe he's trying to make the claim that Tolkien includes things that you would find in what Moorcock would probably consider successful fantasies or epics, the uncanny, the weird, the wonders and the horrors and everything, but he cushions it somehow. And it's like, that is not at all my experience of reading Lord of the Rings. He tends to shove you right down into it, but yeah, I couldn't really, again, I couldn't even figure out what the argument was being made. And then he goes and gives a bunch of quotations from other authors that he considers
Better in some way or
better.
another.
And it's hard, again, he's alternating rapidly back and forth between talking about their prose, talking about their metaphors, their style, and how this one is superior to that one. It's like, okay, like, I can see how you would prefer, I can see trends. I can be like, okay, this one it's a little bit more vivid, a little bit more snappy than some of the other passages. Again, I'm like, maybe let's compare the books more fully side by side. It's really hard to tell from just a paragraph of one versus a paragraph of the other what's a fair distinction here. But he spends a good deal of time talking about prose style, but then snaps back to saying, like, talking about the morals basically of the story, and how, again, by virtue of having looked at the style, we are then supposed to assume that the themes are necessarily good or bad in the same way. And it's just a alternating so rapidly between criticizing on so many different points that he never follows through on the arguments that he's presenting, what arguments he even bothers to present, instead of just leaving you to come up with what you think he thinks.
Yeah. Well, and along that, of all those different authors that he quotes from, he follows up one quotation by saying, clearly this person is a better writer than Tolkien. It's like, you picked one paragraph, compared it to two previous paragraphs, and I'm reading them both, and I'm like, I still like Tolkien's better, and you picked two that you think are really bad. But yeah, you're right. I mean, like, it's like he starts down a train of thought and he never finishes it, and he just jumps and jumps and jumps and keeps jumping it from one thing to another, like he's just on some kind of ADHD trip where he just cannot settle down and make a coherent start to finish argument of, this is why Tolkien's writing is bad, because this, and here's examples, and here's why that's bad. He never sits down and does that. He just kind of assumes, like, if he puts something out there and says, this is horrible, you're just supposed to agree with him. It's like, look, man, everybody's got their own taste. If you don't like Lord of the Rings, then that's fine, but don't pretend you're engaging in literary criticism when all you're really doing is saying, ugly.
Yeah.
And not really providing any meaningful commentary on it.
Right. You can say that, look, this is not to my taste, which we could be like, okay, he is writing an essay, presumably a persuasive essay, so I assume that he's trying to persuade us that, for, if not wholly objective, then at least for reasons that could be understood by a general audience, that his assessment is correct, and that it's more than just a matter of taste, that he can actually point out to superiority, which is really hard to do if you're talking about just style. Authors use different styles. You can deploy them more or less skillfully. They can be more or less emotive or evocative, but you can't really, it's hard to say that this is better than that. Well, it's like, better for what purpose and by what measure? So if he wanted to make that argument, that would be really interesting. I would probably enjoy reading about that. I don't think Tolkien, I enjoy Lord of the Rings, obviously. I don't think Tolkien's style is above critique all the time. I would be willing to look at other authors next to it and say, do they have any advantages or disadvantages? Could we see how you could level critiques against one or the other based on comparing it to authors who are dealing with, I guess, purportedly similar themes and subjects? But that, again, like you said, he never does that. He starts by talking about what appears to be a criticism of style, jumps to some sort of criticism of theme or moral or subject, alternating, again, rapidly between all of them, and then we'll go off on a 2 or 3 paragraph discussion of social and political matters that really, it's just, he's hoping that you will assume that Tolkien is a bad writer because he can make his what he perceives as his political stances seem distasteful.
Yeah.
Instead of taking what you would expect be the simpler and more honest route of, if you actually think Tolkien is a bad writer on a certain metric, then just write that essay. But
Yeah.
that's
Well, but even when he's criticizing on political grounds, he never makes a political argument either.
nope,
He
nope.
just kind of jumps in there and attacks the what he perceives as Tolkien's political views or the Inkling's political views,
Mm-hmm.
and he speaks about them in derogatory ways without ever actually engaging with the theory behind them. He just kind of assumes this is obviously bad. It's like, well, what if I disagree with your politics, Moorcock? I mean, like, what if I
Well,
agree with Tolkien? Does
that's
that mean that I should like his stuff? Or where does that it's
yeah. Should I not like Robin McKinley because you like her and you don't think that people who like Tolkien could like Robin McKinley? Like,
yeah, I don't
it's very strange,
yeah,
and it's actually, it's kind of, I mean, if I were being snarky, I would say, well, of course, once you get specific and make actual claims, you're opening yourself up to people, evaluating those claims, potentially finding logical weaknesses, and then maybe refuting, or at the very least failing to be persuaded by those claims. So it
right,
really is, it's a little bit of a Mark Antony moment, where the artistry of this essay, if you take it not as an actual logical example of argumentation with evidence,
right.
but as just a very skillful suggestion that you come away from, you might be thinking like, oh yeah, I mean, I never really thought of it that way. I guess he has some good points. Well, he never actually makes a point, but he makes it seem like he's made a bunch of them, which
Right.
is it's
And he's
both
relying on you to connect all the dots.
it's both very skillfully done and very kind of creepy when you realize what it is he's doing. At least it was kind of creepy for me.
Yeah, and it's a style of writing that I find very disingenuous. It's like, if you're going to make an argument, but don't just throw out stuff and then act as if you've made an argument,
Mm-hmm.
because the average person, I think, is not on guard enough to really be aware of when an argument has not been made, and therefore falls into the trap of thinking that Michael Moorcock has in fact made an argument, and that argument is good. And the reason they think the argument is good is because they're actually the one that made it in their own head, because Moorcock forced them to do that.
Yes.
So what he's doing is a very insidious method of basically getting you to argue for his position and therefore side with him, because why would you side against yourself who made the argument? So yeah, like you said, it is really kind of creepy if you think about it
Yeah.
in those terms. So, but yeah, I mean, and even apart from that, like there's just and I think this is more of a function of the larger, later version of the essay, because I think the original shorter version was a little bit tighter.
Mm-hmm.
But even it, I think, had this problem where it just rambles so much, because again, he can't really stick to one thing. He's got to keep jumping from one thing to another. And that's
Mm-hmm.
part of why the whole thing works, is because he never finishes a sentence, so to speak.
Yeah, it never
Like,
finishes a thought.
right. I mean, he's got complete sentences. I'm not saying his
Right.
grammar's bad,
I
but
know what you mean. I was
yeah, but for purposes of like what he's actually trying to do, it's as if he never finishes the sentence, and he leaves that little ellipsis there
mm-hmm.
and forces you to fill it in, but he never finishes it himself, and then he jumps on to something else. And so you never feel like, if you're paying attention, you never feel like he ever says anything. It's other than to just be like, bad, this better, this bad. It's like
Yeah.
it's a very emotivist form of writing when
Very
you
emotive.
really look at it.
Skillfully. Again, like it's kind of enjoyable to see the way that he can evoke certain tones, and the way he builds from a sort of disinterested to kind of this peak of passion and then scales it back down. And like he's it's kind of like a musical performance. You can see it go rising and falling, and
Yeah.
making use, of course, of his own methods that he critiqued earlier, of causing the audience to feel something based on the way that you're writing. Tolkien, I guess, makes people feel comfortable, Moorcock wants you to feel angry or appalled or disgusted. And he I think does a good job of hitting those emotional buttons for people. And if you're, again, just reading this casually or uncritically, or if you're like me and you're just like, oh, I've heard that this is an important essay and I should read it, but you're just reading it, you're not really
Critically
taking it
engaging with it.
apart. Yeah. And again, if you maybe you've read Lord of the Rings, but you've read more what other people have said about Lord of the Rings, and maybe that's colored your own understanding of it, then it's very easy to get swept up and swept along and feel at the end like he's said something and he's made some good points, and he, you can't really make an answer to this argument. Well, you can't make an answer to the argument because
It's
he never made an argument. He just gave you the sensation of an argument being made.
Yeah.
I would say that he redeems himself slightly in the last paragraph. And I think it's maybe worth pointing out, because otherwise it does seem like, why this level of vitriol against someone whose writing is, you have to admit, is terribly influential in the genre in which Moorcock is working.
So much so that there are literal, and Moorcock points this out and criticizes the fact that there are people who basically just copy Tolkien. I mean, that's how influential Tolkien is.
Yeah, and I mean, I think again, we're looking at the updated version that was written, has to have been in the 2000s, because he makes references to Harry Potter.
Right.
Which I thought was kind of funny in itself.
We won't go there, though.
We won't go there. Yeah, for many reasons, I thought it was funny. But when he wrote this originally, I believe it was the 70s, wasn't it?
I think so, yeah.
And this was admittedly kind of a rough time for, I don't want to say literature in general, but especially for, quote, genre fiction and for the fantasy genre. And you'd be looking the kinds of books and magazines that Moorcock would have had to have been publishing in. And he talks about the anthologies that are being put together at this point. It was very much a world in which the people who could imitate Tolkien most unoriginally, I guess, were the ones that frequently met with the most commercial reward. So he mentions that, he talks about how the writers who most slavishly imitate Tolkien seem to be using English as a rather inexpertly learned second language. So many of them are unbelievably bad that they just defy description and are scarcely worth listing individually. He talks about Terry Pratchett, who is an excellent author, being the only Terry in Fantasyland who is able to write a decent complex sentence, so I won't name names, but I have definitely felt this frustration that he's feeling reading the so-called classics of the late half of the 20th century in the fantasy genre, and just being like, this is like insultingly, like, this is a parody of Lord of the Rings. It's not even like, inspired by Lord of the Rings. It's just, no, it's a blatant cash grab, and it's kind of repulsive. And I think he says that, that these writers are rewarded with the lavish lifestyles of the most successful whores is unsurprising. So I believe there's additionally a little bit of bitterness here in that this style that people would have called Tolkienian, but may in fact have had very little to do with, like, what's actually going on in Lord of the Rings.
Right.
That this was being lionized as the only way to write successful fantasy. And Moorcock is quite, I think, understandably chafing against that and resentful of that. And he cares about writing, obviously, and he wants to do kind of his own thing with it and to take the fantasy genre in a different direction that has more energy and more craft and skill. I think the problem here is that he places the blame on Tolkien, and specifically on the politics of, again, quote, that kind of writer. That's the problem. It's like, well, that's maybe a different problem than just the fact that bad cliche books sell and they happen to be selling really well at this period in time. Like, he had no way of foreseeing the sort of fantasy renaissance of the late 90s through the mid 2000s. So
yeah,
I can see that there is kind of an attempt at an argument in the last like couple paragraphs that actually does seem to have some merit, and I think explains some of the vitriol more effectively than actually Moorcock's own arguments do. But it doesn't excuse the rest of the essay.
Right. I mean, the rest of the essay is just, to the extent that it may be motivated by that, it's, like you said, aimed at entirely the wrong target. It's like,
yes,
that is a function of virtually every realm of artistic endeavor. Something is wildly successful, lots of people try to imitate it, and most of them do it badly.
Yes,
I
and
mean, but that doesn't mean the original wasn't good. I
well,
mean,
it's irrelevant. The original could be good or bad or just kind of normal, but he again, that's he takes it quite personally, I think.
it does seem like it.
And he draws some conclusions that I think are more gratifying to his own injured ego and non-literary opinions, let's say, than an actual cool-headed critical examination of why this should be the case and what the actual effects are.
Yeah.
Disappointing.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, I've never read a criticism of Tolkien that actually held water. And Moorcock is maybe the most extreme example of this. But this is kind of why we're doing this series. Is so many of the critics of Tolkien, as Tolkien himself points out, don't seem to have actually read Tolkien, at least not very carefully.
No,
But with that said, we've been going for a good while now, so we
we
better
have indeed.
call it. But I will link not only to the Epic Poo essay itself, I'm also going to link to that video that you referenced earlier about the Shire and how it's really not the idyllic paradise that we all think it is.
Oh boy.
Because that is a very, and let me just say, everybody, don't engage in flame wars because listen to the whole thing before you criticize that video, because it's a very well thought out video and it actually makes a lot of really good points. I don't necessarily agree with every point she makes, but she certainly makes a lot of good ones. And it does come to a very deep issue that's being touched on here by Moorcock. And so if you can understand where Tolkien is really coming from with his portrayal of the Shire, you'll understand why Moorcock is so missing the boat on his criticism of Tolkien. So it's well worth understanding what's really going on there, and GirlNextGondor does a very good job of explaining what's going on there in ways that Moorcock does not understand.
By Tolkien's own claim and measure too, at certain points. That's the other thing that I ruffled several feathers, which I was actually kind of intending to do and looking forward to. But the number of people who were just seemed mortally offended that I would suggest that Tolkien himself didn't think the Shire was a perfect paradise, when I cite, I think, 4 or 5 points where he says literally just that. I don't think the Shire is perfect. I don't think it's something that should be uncritically emulated. I think that hobbits have real serious social problems that the book is kind of about them coming to grips with in the end. And Tolkien himself said it, and everyone else says, no, that's not actually what Tolkien meant. That's not.
Well, and the one that comes to mind to me too is I'm sure a lot of these people are going to say, Tolkien said, I'm a hobbit in all but size. And I'm going to turn around and say, yes, he also said he's most like Faramir, except for physical courage.
Yes.
Tolkien recognized he himself had weaknesses. So it's not like Tolkien saw himself as some ideal person either. So
I would say, if anything, he probably tends to be more self-deprecating than he ought to be.
Oh, absolutely. And he had a lot of his own kinds of depression and anxieties and things that
For sure.
we're not gonna psychoanalyze the man, but
no.
let that be a context for when you watch her video on the Shire. Don't take it as a personal attack on the fact that you would love to live in the Shire. I'd love to live in the Shire too.
Tolkien probably would have loved to live in the Shire.
Almost certainly. But not for the reason that the society itself was a utopia.
Not because it's perfect, yes.
Right.
No place is perfect. To say that Tolkien thinks any place and any society is perfect is, again, as we just saw, that's to do a grave disservice to the work he actually does to make things way more complex than they even need to be. Right. Because he is very attuned to the good and the bad sides of almost any trait. And I think the fact that, a lot of people don't see that is due to the fact that they have a preconceived notion about what Tolkien is writing about. So then when they're actually reading Tolkien, they're blind to the rather subtle hints that he is putting in, and to his craft. And so then you walk away from Lord of the Rings thinking this is a straightforward adventure fantasy novel, when it's at every turn almost anything but.
Right. So with that said, we will leave it here. Probably going to be looking to do at least one more of these videos in the future. Won't say on what just now, but
Yeah.
we'll try to do at least one more of these. So be on the lookout for that in some time in the future. Not going to make promises. With that said, if you have not subscribed to Girl Next Gondor, please do. She's got really great content. Please subscribe to this channel if you want to catch more of my stuff. And we will see you the next time.
Good.
Namarie.